In the year when no one counted the years, a great tragedy happened in the kingdom of Denmark. After a terrible fight, a great deal of people were killed, changing the history of Denmark forever. Everyone knows their names. There was Claudius, Laertes, Gertrude, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, the flowery Ophelia and the mad prince Hamlet. All of them were dead, but thankfully there was one person who brought them back to life. His name was Fortinbras, the new king of Denmark, who learned about the tragedy after it happened and who decided to immortalize the story of the prince, thus making the last wish of Hamlet come true, the wish for everyone to know about what had happened in the castle of Elsinore. Thus it was Fortinbras to whom we are grateful for knowing about this story of the Prince of Denmark. But there was one woman who disagreed with that course of events. It's all fiction, she said, because in reality things happened quite opposite to what was described in the tragedy of Hamlet, Prince of Denmark. Yes, there was Hamlet, there was Denmark, there were the murders, there was the tragedy, but Fortinbras, he never really came, she said. Time passed. Horatio was getting older, everyone started to forget about what had happened in the court of Elsinore, until in the end there was not a single person in the whole kingdom to remember the deeds of the year when no one counted the years. And the story started over and over again, she said. The new tragic age was arising from the ashes of the old tragic age, trapping the people of the kingdom in a vicious circle of history and oblivion. The woman's name was Oksana Zabuzhko, a Ukrainian writer, poet and philosopher who, during her lifetime, witnessed and chronicled how the tragedy always comes back if it is left unspoken. As you understand, today's video is dedicated precisely to Oksana Zabuzhko, probably the most important contemporary Ukrainian intellectual, and the way she manages to reflect on the rhymes of history. And let us start with a tragedy, with a treason and murder that happened in the kingdom of Ukraine. Or in the words of Horatio, let us speak of carnal, bloody and unnatural acts, of accidental judgments, casual slaughters, of deaths put on by cunning and forced cause. Oksana Zabuzhko was born in 1960 in what was probably the biggest prison ever devised by mankind, the Soviet Union. Her family was part of the movement that we nowadays call the 60ers, who were allowed much more freedom than the previous generations to speak up about the inequalities and repressions towards the national cultures. And there was quite a lot to tell. Even the father of Zabuzhko was repressed in the 1948 and sent to Gulag for 6 years. Then he was freed, and then there was another round of repressions. The family had to move to another city to run away from the KGB, etc., etc. I could go on like this and tell you in what order the events happened in the life of Oksana Zabuzhko during the Soviet era. But that's not quite the way to tell you who she really was and what times she lived in. Let me explain this. In her magnum opus novel, The Museum of Abandoned Secrets, there is a main character, Darina, who lives in independent Ukraine and whose father died long ago in an asylum during the Soviet times. One day Darina rummages through her library and accidentally finds a book in which there is a sentence that was underlined by her father a long time ago. The sentence went as follows: Hamlet's hesitation to act decisively in sight of triumphing evilness. And on the margins by the side of this sentence there was one single word written in pencil, this, with 3 exclamation marks. Now, this seemingly small fact changes everything that she's ever known about her father. She realizes that the reason he was put into the asylum was because he was trying with all his energy to prove that he was not hesitant, that he would stand up in sight of triumphing evilness, that he wouldn't be Hamlet. And precisely for the reason of him deciding not to be Hamlet, he was punished and incarcerated and made to disappear by the Soviet state. Darina, his daughter, ponders, the entire narrative of his life, if we were to reconstruct it with documentary faithfulness capturing all 4 folders and their knotted-to-death strings, had no point, only bitterness and waste. The point was in the epigraph, in the watermark, in a single, nearly straight line that was accidentally preserved. And it isn't just about that single person who was put into the asylum, it's about the whole way in which we as humans think about history and biography. We tend to think of them in terms of big events. There are births, wars, marriages, emigrations, and there are deaths. Those are important, but they are missing something quite essential, something that you cannot describe as a point on the timeline. But those are the things that matter the most. They are telling the story of the living being rather than of a clockwork mechanism. But even though this habit of reducing people to their biographies is something quite universal, in the Soviet Union this habit was at its monstrous peak. The system was intentionally trying to clear any kinds of unwanted characteristics and episodes both from history and from the people who lived in it, just as it happened with the father of Darina, who was reduced to a number of facts in his made-up criminal case, and just as it happened with the whole history of Ukraine, which was filled up with tons of lies created by the Soviet Union and its twin sister, Russia. It seems that Oksana Zabuzhko sees it as one of her primary aims to tell the real stories that happened to the people of her country, the stories that would be much more telling than any kind of a history book. That's why in her books you can find a whole lot of small, embedded stories, and you can be sure that all of those have really happened or have historical prototypes, because, as she once said, with a reality like ours, you don't have to make anything up. To make an interesting book, you just have to look around at the tragic age that you live in. Speaking about these small stories, there is one quote that Oksana Zabuzhko shares that has always struck me as painfully true. It goes as follows: "We will die and be forgotten." It wasn't a quote by Socrates, nor by Seneca, not even by Sartre or Camus. It was a quote by a girl, Katya, who was dying of leukemia after the Chernobyl disaster of 1986, probably the biggest tragedy of the age of tragedies. "We will die and be forgotten" is a phrase that gets to the exact bottom of it. It is a phrase of fear of disappearing from history, fear of dying in a tragedy, and absolutely no one caring about your death. It feels like that's the exact reason why writing is so important for countries like Ukraine. It allows you not to be forgotten, at least for a little bit. And Oksana Zabuzhko, being one of the key writers of our age, is someone who takes the role of not letting her people be forgotten and dissolved in history. But that was a fear of the Soviet age, of the tragic age where you were not allowed to be who you wanted to be, you always had to be defined by others. In 1991 that changed. Ukraine finally regained its independence, and the biggest prison ever devised by mankind collapsed. The post-tragic age brought a whole lot of things: books, realizations, revolutions, crying, laughter, peace and restlessness. Oksana Zabuzhko was part of that pandemonium, and a central one in 1996, having published her most famous novel, Fieldwork in Ukrainian. Everyone knew about this novel and everyone wanted to get it because, as we all know, there was no in the USSR, so everyone was curious to find out what it was like. Unfortunately, when they opened it, they were very, very disappointed because it wasn't about at all. In addition to that disappointment, many people were highly critical of the novel because, quote, "It undermines the established role of the woman in the society, it acts against the needs of the nation, it misleads the youth about the place and mission of the genders in the society, it destroys the foundations of public morality." In the Soviet times, this would have been enough to send the author for a vacation in Gulag, but back then, and especially nowadays, these 4 points are the biggest compliments a book can get. So what is it about? Being a philosophical and a modernist novel, it's not really about the plot or the story that is being told, it's more about style and reflections included in the novel. And one of the key reflections here is about the burden of history, about how the tragedy reminds about itself despite being long over, and about how the past dictates its patterns to the present. And in the case of Ukraine, those patterns were not much to be desired because those were the patterns of censorship, deprivation and murder, of attempts by other countries to bring you into non-existence. Oksana Zabuzhko revises the ideas of the existential freedom by saying that the freedom of the Ukrainian people is the freedom to choose between one of the two things, either staying Ukrainian and being destined to be forgotten, just as hundreds of artists, writers, and intellectuals have been forgotten, or changing your identity and becoming Russian, Polish, American, or a citizen of any other country that would allow you to exist. This had to do with the context of the age, where after a few decades of Russification during the Soviet times and a few hundred years of language repressions under the Russian Empire, the overwhelming majority of city population in Ukraine did not speak their native tongue, did not know much about the Ukrainian culture, literature, or art. Oksana Zabuzhko was highly critical of that state. She was desperate not to allow the Ukrainian culture to go extinct. The irony of that was revealed when a publisher, having read the novel, got straight to the point. The novel was great, it had to be published, but perhaps in Russian. What is that language, Ukrainian? Who speaks that? This was approximately the climate of the age, which didn't see the Ukrainian language as necessary for most people in the country, which is why in her novel Zabuzhko says that the existential choice of the Ukrainians is a choice between non-existence and an existence that kills you. Either you're Ukrainian and no one is ever going to care about you, or you simply stop being Ukrainian and move to the other camp. It is exactly the situation where you're caught between a rock and a hard place, the situation where, in Hamlet's words, the time is out of joint, and the situation out of which there is apparently no way out. At the same time, this colonial state of Ukrainian culture was not just about politics. In Zabuzhko's novel, it's also about how the political has an impact on the personal and how history shapes relations between people. She pays special attention to the state of women in the colonized societies and says that those women are in a way doubly colonized. Firstly, they are colonized as members of the colony, even if they live in a country that is legally no longer a colony, and secondly, they are colonized as women in a patriarchal society. All of those patterns of colonization map onto each other and create a very strangely depressing effect on the people, which makes the narrator wonder, why the hell would one come into this world a woman, and in Ukraine yet, with this f***ing dependency programmed into your body like a delayed action bomb, with this craziness, this need to be transformed into moist, squishy clay needed into the Earth's surface. This is what the narrator calls the eternal Ukrainian curse of non-existence, the constant feeling that your homeland is not simply the land of your birth. A true homeland is a country that can kill you. But despite understanding that fatal state of the people in the country, the novel is really about trying to overcome this complex, trying to break out of that vicious circle of history where you are almost never allowed to be a subject. This is one of the biggest pains of the narrator and probably of the author. They want to be heard not as victims, not as someone who has been beaten, but as someone equal, someone who can be interesting and thought-provoking and deep. In other words, they want to be valued for existence rather than non-existence. And I can say that this novel, in a way, did achieve what it meant to achieve, either directly or indirectly. The Ukrainian society and our relation to the past indeed changed quite drastically, to the point that you really wish to disagree with the novel because it is no longer exactly like that. You can finally be Ukrainian and not be pushed into non-existence. You can finally cherish your own culture and language and literature, and you can finally live on your land freely. Until someone knocks at your door with a rifle. In his famous 1989 essay, Francis Fukuyama had a vision of the end of history, where he argued that since the major enemies of the Western democracies have been defeated, there would no longer be any kind of global struggle between ideologies, that liberal democracies were going to be the final form of human government, and that everything was moving towards one global utopia. Francis Fukuyama was never more wrong about anything. The Yugoslav wars, 9/11, the war on terror were but a few major conflicts that were shouting that the history is nowhere near the end. Specifically, many historians are connecting this with the political course of Russia. Timothy Garton Ash, for example, makes a point that a new era in the history of humankind started with the annexation of Georgian territories by Russia in 2008. And of course, it has a lot to do with Ukraine, which Russia has always seen as its main colony and was very eager to get it back after the collapse of the Soviet Empire. Oksana Zabuzhko in her works often shows how Russia has essentially always been the same thing and always used the same methods to achieve what it wanted. In her most recent book, The Longest Journey, she analyzes leaked documents from the Soviet secret services from the 1960s and sees that after the collapse of the Union, Russia was using the exact same methods to occupy and colonize other countries as the Soviet Union did. According to one such document published by Yuri Bezmenov, the process of subversion of any country consisted of 4 steps. First, demoralization, a stage that lasts from 15 to 20 years, during which the goal is to establish full control over culture, religion, education, etc. by non-violent methods, so as to make it seem like Russia is not an enemy at all, but a very close friend. Then destabilization, which lasts from 3 to 5 years, during which the basis of the state, its economy and defense are subverted. Then the crisis, which implies an armed conflict lasting up to 6 months, the goal of which is to replace the government in the country and make it a satellite. And then normalization, during which all of the spheres of life are reformed according to the needs of Russia. In her essay, Oksana Zabuzhko analyzes how each of these first 3 steps were applied in Ukraine starting from the 90s. For example, one part of the first demoralization stage was to reduce the amount of Ukrainian language books to the minimum, to achieve which major Russian publishing houses were approaching famous authors from abroad and buying the translation and publishing rights not just for Russia, but for the whole post-Soviet bloc. This way, the only legal way to buy the majority of foreign books was by buying them from the Russian publishers and in Russian. Now, Oksana Zabuzhko gives a lot more argumentation of how it all came to the war we have today, but her major point is that history always comes back if you don't learn from it. So precisely because Russia's invasions, genocides and repressions were never condemned, published or even noticed under the veneer of its culture, literature or art, precisely because of that, Russia has always come back to do more invasions, more genocides and more repressions. It is a wheel that is going to roll until the very moment when everyone decides to put a spoke in it. So coming back to the story of Hamlet, Prince of Denmark, we can say that in reality it was a story that never ended. Hamlet died, Claudius died, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern died, but there was no one to hear their story, to chronicle it and pass it down to ancestors so that it never repeats. A whole new generation was born, a new king mysteriously died, a new Hamlet was in despair over what was to be done, a new bloodbath happened in Elsinore, and a new Fortinbras came in to listen to what had happened in the kingdom of Denmark. And let us hope that this one time the world will finally listen to the story of Hamlet, Prince of Denmark, and hear all the sorrows that happened in the castle of Elsinore. And the rest is silence.